welcome to the transportation seminar. It's a pleasure today to welcome Carlota Pedersen-Madero. She's a Danish architect and a graduate of the Universidad de Buenos Aires. She's born in Switzerland. She has lived in Panama, Argentina, Denmark, and France, and she worked with the Gale architects for 4 years in Denmark before she came back to Argentina to help in setting up the innovation office for the transportation secretariat. Currently she's an advisor for the Undersecretary of Mobility and Planning of Buenos Aires. Thanks, Carlota, and it's a pleasure to have you here today with us.
Thank you, Professor Kennedy. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's an honor to be part of this set of conferences. This presentation that I bring to you is a little bit a mix of my personal story with the different experiences that I've had, because I moved to Denmark for 4 years, and I worked at Gale. And I learned a bunch of stuff at Gale. And then I came back to Buenos Aires, which is my city as well, because I'm half Argentinian, half Danish. And my biggest challenge has been to land many of the things that I've been learning in Copenhagen. And that's kind of what this story is about. So if it's okay with you, I'll start the presentation. And I'm going to talk to you about the human dimension in the culture of mobility. When we talk about mobility, we often talk about efficiency, we talk about capacity, we talk about frequency, and it's mainly related to engines. So it's about cars, about buses, about public transport, but what about the human scale in all of this? And what about people walking, because walking is also a transport mode? What about people cycling, because cycling is also a transport mode? So what's happening with all this mobility, this soft mobility that is somehow lost when we measure or when we look at mobility and transport in cities? And there's a very quote from them that you measure what you care about. And actually, in my experience, is very much true. When you go to cities, they really often have these big bureaus with a lot of screens everywhere, and you see highways and cars and flying cars and buses and trains and all like the big things. But it's very weird to find in cities like actually this kind of monitoring of people walking, of people cycling. Because when we talk about transit, and of course you all know about this, but I think it's refreshing to talk about it and to think about it. It's not only about the transit, it's not only about going from A to B, it's about
There's a connection problem, Carlota.
So I was saying that it's not just about transit, and it's not only about going from A to B, but it's about the experience that we have when we move in a city. It's about the experience of mobility and everything that happens in between. So one of the biggest things that I've learned at Gale, and of course, you don't need to work at Gale for 4 years to realize this. When you read Jan's books, you already see it, but it's so true, is that we know less about people than any other animal. And you turn on the TV and you see Discovery Channel and you know everything that you need to know about what a chimpanzee needs to have in its environment and to be happy, to feel good, to feel free, to what does it need, what temperature, what surrounding. So we know much more about many other animals than us. And we have to remember that we are animals, we are Homo sapiens, and we are super sensitive to our environment. So being a human being, and that's a little bit the starting point to think about the human dimension in cities, is to understand how we work, how our body works. So all of our senses are directed to the same place. We have an average human viewpoint of 160 centimeters. Of course, when you're younger, it's lower, but around that. We need stimulus to feel good. So if there's very strong noise, or if it smells very bad, or if we see stuff that we don't like, we tend to not to stay in a specific space or place. We have an average speed of 5 kilometers an hour. And we need a stimulus like every 4 seconds in a city for our brain not to get bored. So that's why, and the shopping malls, they really know everything about this because they have kind of this rhythm. And the streets that we often love in a city, they have all these different facades, and they have all these different experiences, and different, they have this diversity. And those streets are the ones that we tend to choose when we go and travel to cities or in our own city. And of course, you can say that cultures are super different, and they are. But I think, and we think, that there's more things that unite us as humans than the ones that pulls us apart in a cultural way. So it doesn't matter if you are in a conference room in Sweden, or in the beach in Rio, or in the streets in India, or in the port in Copenhagen. The way we interact as people are very often very similar. So, and when we think about the foundations of a healthy life, and this has to do again with this, the place, the habitat that we create for ourselves. And you can ask a doctor or anyone, and I think that now with this crisis of the COVID and the coronavirus, it's even more clear that the things that makes us happy and the things that we need that are super basic is fresh air, exercise, and meeting people. I don't know about you guys, but here in Buenos Aires, we're having one of the longest quarantines in the planet. And we have been inside almost for 7 months. And it's really, really amazing how these 3 elements are a little bit the foundation of feeling good, of feeling free. And we often see this kind of really ridiculous images in a city, where, imagine this situation for a while. You have these 2 guys, they jumped into their cars, they have driven for 15 minutes, they park their cars, they go up an electric escalator where they have to do nothing, to enter a fitness room, to then use a machine that emulates going up the stairs and walking or running. So many times we see cities that are not inviting people to take the healthy, or inviting people to take the healthy and the nice kind of option of living a healthier life. And you end up having this really weird kind of structures in the city. And we have to remember that streets are public space. So when we talk about transport, we have a really big responsibility to understand that it's not only about moving, it's also about staying, and it's also about understanding how we want to move. So streets make up around 20 to 30% of cities, and 80% of that open space are streets. So the streets has a really, really big impact when we talk about mobility and when we talk about the experience of public space. And one of the elements that we often talked about at Gale was that mobility is about public transport, is about cycling, it's about walking, and public space is the glue that attaches everything together. You need to think about public space in that way and not as independent silos, because otherwise you tend to forget the experience and understand that the experience is complete. So I learned all this stuff and many other stuff, but just a little bit of a preview of the things that I've learned. And I landed in Buenos Aires after 4 years. So I went from the private sector in Denmark to the public sector in Argentina. And it's actually exactly what you're imagining. That you're imagining, it's exactly that. So it has been super tough. I was very happy to have Anastasia by my side, helping me and trying to help me land in this very complex, challenging change. And one of the first things that from the innovation office we were looking at, because our role from innovation was to help teams to do better projects through better processes, had to do with cycling in Buenos Aires. So for more than 10 years, this is the city of Buenos Aires, and the city of Buenos Aires for more than 10 years has been investing in cycling infrastructure. And it reached to 245 kilometers of protected cycleways. So if you look at this plan, you could say that it's quite of a really good and covered structure for cycling. And over 10 years, they had established some parameters that were very much related to mobility and not to city. And I want to stress this point because you cannot think about mobility without thinking about city. And I think that's one of the key elements and key challenges that we always have within the city, that you have kind of the urbanist team and then the transport team. And sometimes we talk in different languages because, and it's very important to mix this stuff up. So the parameters that was established 10 years ago to make this grid grow was that you would only do cycling infrastructure in secondary streets, avoid avenues due to their high volume of traffic, no bike lanes on streets with more than 3 lines of buses, the continuity and the streets are prioritized, avoid streets with schools, hospitals, and police stations, and avoid double-way streets. So when we got this list of parameters, I think that our first question with Anastasia was like, why, and why? Because somehow it didn't make really sense that we had this really strict parameters that were only based in transport, basically. So, and one of the challenges that the team was experiencing was that because they had set this really strict parameters, that they were out of streets that they could actually intervene. There was no more streets in the city that had these parameters. So how can you continue building a cycling culture when you have a very strict guideline that you have to follow? But why aren't people cycling that much? Because we had 245 kilometers of cycling, which was a lot for a city like Buenos Aires. And if you compare it to other Latin American cities, it's a lot. But we had only like 3-4% of our modal split that was in bicycle. And for those who do cycle, where do they? So we started this process to gather data. And this is really important. And I know that I'm saying a bunch of really obvious stuff, but I think that in a process, it's very key that you need to get the key data to tell your story. And that has been a little bit the process to try to understand why the parameters were like that, what was happening in the city after 10 years, because the city was not the same 10 years after they installed the first bike lane. And what could we do to shake a little bit those parameters to try to reach 10% of cyclists, 15% of cyclists, try to be more ambitious of how many cyclists we wanted in the city. So if we looked at the plan, and this is kind of this is the area that is the most dense area in the city, The use within the network was quite high in some places, as you can see here. And the yellow lines are places where there is less than 250 cyclists per day, so it's really low. But when you saw the use out of this structure, 6 out of 10 were moving outside this network. And if we looked a little bit more in detail, the cyclists tended to choose the main corridors, which was, of course, avenues. Avenues connect neighborhoods, they connect the city, they're fast, they connect a bunch of places where people want to go. So it was kind of, for me, also living in Copenhagen for 4 years and being Danish and having lived a little bit half and half, for me it was a little bit strange to have this idea that you couldn't put a cycleway in an avenue, which is actually the place where everyone wants to cycle, because cycling is not only like for a holiday or like a weekend thing, but it's a way of transport. So, and actually the behavior of people in the city was actually responding to this hypothesis. Then we're starting to look at accidents in our city, which is very important to like the security of mobility. And we realized that 86% of the fatal accidents occurred outside of the built network, which was in some ways a very good news, because the cycling structure that we were building was actually safe. And the 14% that was out of this 86 was accidents that only happened in intersections. So it was really interesting to see, okay, the structure is working, but if we go back and we realize that 6 out of 10 people are moving out of the network, we need to address this challenge. We cannot continue to ignore it. And then we did a bunch of sessions with cyclists and people that were potential cyclists, but that they were, why? And the main question was like, why aren't you using your bike? What is the city doing wrong for you, for not inviting you to cycle? And there was a bunch of stuff that appeared from this working session and work with these different people. But 3 elements were the main elements. First, there was a lot of like road violence. So people are still very aggressive in transit. So it's very like, I want to go first and I want to ride fast, or I don't care about you. There's not really a priority to the pedestrian or the cyclist. So it's kind of this fight constantly. So that was not very encouraging for people that were not used to bike. Then the other element was the perception of security and the bad experience. Many times the cycle infrastructure was placed in streets that were basically dead. Nothing was really happening. So, and one of the things that we realized, and especially this was something that was a claim from women, that they were saying, I prefer when I'm in a bike to prioritize my security as a civic security and not my mobility security. So I prefer to take streets that are livable. I prefer to drive in avenues where everything is happening, instead of taking the small street that is a little bit lost and that has a beautiful infrastructure, but where I don't feel safe. And then the third point, and this is not like this is reality, like these 2 diagrams that I'm showing. If you wanted to go to this point A to this point B, this is the recommended route if you wanted to arrive safely. Literally, you had to look at your phone like 1,000 times to understand where you have to go right or left. And it was there was so many more kilometers that you had to do to arrive to your destination. So the other thing that was asked is like, please give us some direct routes to arrive to the places where we want to go. So after 14 meetings, only 14 meetings, we managed to convince the decision makers to build the main two avenues of the city that had more cyclists. And of course, you can tell me, ay, Carlota, this is so obvious, like build the structure where the cyclists are. And you know, something I'm learning working in the city is that behind every before and after picture that you see of a city that is like, oh, it looks so easy and so wonderful, there are so many meetings and so many challenges and so many fights that you can't imagine. So yeah, it's a long process, but we managed to do it. We really insisted into doing it. And we went from, we choose these two avenues that I'm talking about, Corrientes and Córdoba, that are very emblematic. Corrientes, I don't know if some of you have been in Buenos Aires or have seen images of Buenos Aires. You have the obelisk, which is the national monument. And there's the widest avenue on the planet, 200 meters. I don't know why they're proud about that, but they are for some reason, because it's gigantic, but whatever. So the cycleway was crossing that gigantic avenue. And we went from this situation where there was a lot of cyclists that had no infrastructure whatsoever to this image that you see here. And we had to build something that was really, really cheap because the city has very little money. And those are before and after pictures. So instead of having this situation, we formalized something that was already happening. And that was kind of our key argument to build this. It's like you can decide to ignore it and to understand that six out of 10 cyclists are traveling out of the infrastructure, and that 88% of very dangerous accident happen outside, or you can decide to acknowledge it and to formalize it. So that was kind of the key data element. And after only, so we finished these two routes, and we have so many messages of people super happy about this. And actually, oh, these numbers, they're wrong. Actually, it's even more. I had to change it, but well, it doesn't matter. So after only 1 week of implementation, there was a huge increase in cyclists. And actually the last numbers that we got is that Corrientes, if we compare to 2019 to today, there was an increase of 232% of cyclists, 232. So all this data, gathering the data of before and after, is so important to convince decision makers what to do and to make sure that we're going the right way, because we can of course get it wrong. And Córdoba had an increase of 201%. Another thing that was very, very interesting is that for 10 years, we were not managing as a city to invite more women to ride bicycle percentage-wise. So it was always around 18%, maximum 18% of women. And now with these two cycleways, we already seeing a very big increase. If you think about 10% of increase of women in only 1 week after implementation, it's a very, very good news. And there's a very positive opinion impact that will help us, hopefully, leverage for future projects. And we are in a situation, and I don't know how it is right now in Canada, but newspapers are not really managing to give any good news whatsoever. Everything is terrible, like from Trump to climate change to whatever you can think of. And I think that this is one of the very few good news that the newspaper is managing to give. So that's something that the city is quite proud of. And the bicycle sales are increasing significantly. Like Mercado Libre is for us like an Amazon, and there has been 131% increase in selling bicycles. And yeah, so all the percentage related to increasing in selling bikes are really, really strong. And we also have to think about that in Latin American countries and cities like Buenos Aires, the bicycle has also become a tool, a working tool. So I think that I'm not sure that Canada has this kind of Rappi and Pedido Ya. They are delivery, they work in delivery. So they have this backpacks, and they bring stuff from food to keys that you forgot to going to the supermarket, whatever. They are a delivery in the like most big term you can think of. And actually this is a very, very strong and very positive place for people that would have no job today to actually have a job. And because we have been 7 months inside of our places, I order my food over Rappi. I order my the pharmacy, the diapers I have to buy for my kids, everything you can think of. And they ride bikes. They move in bikes. So it's also a very important thing that we have to give them more space for them to move in a safe way, because it is also this kind of app that you have to be there 35 minutes, and if it's more than 35 minutes, then you get it for free. So the poor guys that are cycling like crazy all over the city, if they have to do this really weird kind of A to B points, it's very hard to accomplish those 35 minutes. And we are receiving also very happy news from these companies where they say, today we're testing Corrientes in Córdoba. They're the width are very good. They're greatly improved delivery times in the center and downtown. It's safe for drivers. So yeah, and there has been a 50% increase during pandemic for this cyclist. So now we are at a stage, okay, we have Córdoba and Corrientes, and now we have to go for more. And this is the network that we're proposing, which is bringing the network where the neighbors live to the network where and the network takes you where you want to go, which is the destination. And this is kind of the base of transport and of mobility. Origin, destination, very simple. And you could say, yeah, but Buenos Aires is very big. How can you actually, like, how many trips can you actually do on a bike? And actually, we realized, and again, the importance of the data, and I really insist on this because these are really the game changers, is that 66.5% of the trips that are done in Buenos Aires go from 1 to 5 kilometers, which is totally a bikeable distance. So this was, again, one of the very strong arguments for actually decision makers to say, okay, let's try it out. We have in Buenos Aires a very big challenge to informal settlements, slums. We have 12%, and apparently that's gonna increase. Very sadly, that's gonna increase a lot after the pandemic. But 12.5% of the population of Buenos Aires, they live in these vulnerable neighborhoods. So one of the key elements that we are proposing and pushing for is that all vulnerable neighborhoods will have a cycling infrastructure coverage. We have to make them part of our planning. And they haven't really been part of our planning till now. So we want to respond through this demand through a mixed network, through 3 typologies. the typologies of avenues that I was showing you before. Then there's the two-way bike lanes. This is the type of structure that was already like the one that they have been building for 10 years. And then full streets, which are neighborhood streets, where the infrastructure is very, very low because the speed is very low. So basically it is, as a rule, like the higher the speed of the street, the more infrastructure you need. The lower speed of the street, the less infrastructure you need. That's kind of a general rule. So we are trying to aim, and this is super ambitious, to go from a network that has 245 kilometers to a network that has 400 kilometers. And as you see, much more coverage in the south of the city, which is the poorest part of the city, and the west of the city, which is the poorest part of the city as well, or is one of the most challenging as well. And that's our aim for 2022, if we managed to convince them. So that's it for me. Thank you so much for listening.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks, Carlota. This is very interesting and engaging. And I'm going to start with my own question first. I'll take advantage of myself, and then I'll ask Professor De van Leeuwen from Netherlands to ask the next question. But I'll start with mine quickly. You talked about the silos between departments when you move to Buenos Aires, and because these silos, we see them here in Canada, we see them, how much these silos were when you were in Denmark? And like, because I see them in Canada, so, and you saw them, so were they present as well in Denmark, or not as much?
I think that it's a challenge that every city has, this silos, because you have to have like the public transport ministry, and then you have the transportation ministry, and the public space ministry, and the health ministry, and the economy industry ministry. So you have those silos, and we see them as well in Copenhagen. But I think that the key is how to coordinate between them. So it's not necessarily bad that you have silos. It's bad if they don't talk with each other. So I think that the approach that Copenhagen has had for the last 20 years is that when you have very big projects, you always have around the table people from different ministries that can make sure that by the end of the project, by the end of the implementation, every angle of the project has been considered. And I think that in Buenos Aires is more challenging because there's also, and you realize this working in the city, there's also an ego fight because it's politics. So there's an ego fight between ministers, and they want to be the ones that are like acknowledged for that project or that project. So then I think that it's also a cultural thing to try to make people understand that if it's everyone's project, it's a better and stronger one. But it's hard when you land in a culture where there is still a very strong individual feeling of, okay, this is my project, and this is, look how good I managed to make it. So I think it's challenging, it's possible, but it's super challenging.
Okay. Good. So now we'll go to the Netherlands for a question from Professor De van Leeuwen from Utrecht. 1 second.
There we go, I'm unmuted. Thanks very much for your presentation. That's very interesting. I have a follow-up question on the silos question, actually. Of course, cycling is integrated with other modes, and I'm wondering if you can tell a little bit, or tell us a little bit how the cycling network is integrated with the bike share network, with the public transport network, but also something as simple as safe bike parking for commuters that maybe are biking into the downtown in the morning and leaving their bike somewhere, I presume, hopefully safely, so that they can bike back home. Is this something that is in the plan?
Of course, parking is one of our biggest challenges because there's a lot of vandalism, and there's a lot of people robbing bikes. So we have realized over time that actually if you just put like the classic parking places that you see in the Netherlands, that you see in Copenhagen, even though they still steal a lot of bikes there. I don't know how it is in the Netherlands, but in Copenhagen, they steal a bike every 1 minute, literally every 1 minute. So the thing is that in Buenos Aires, even if you attach the bike to like a pole or whatever, they maybe take the seat or they maybe take a wheel. So it's super challenging. So we have done a bunch of different policies to try to make it safe. So there's been a law where all the parking places in the city where you pay some money to leave your car, they have to have places to leave your bike. So of course you have to pay, and the city gives you those free options. But of course, you cannot have like a camera pointing to each one of those parking spaces. So that has been one of the elements. Then talking a lot with the different private companies for them to have showers and places to park your bike within the building. There's also like every new building that is built has to have in their area of parking cars space for one bike per unit. So it's a very challenging theme, but we are trying to solve it. I think it's something like any challenging theme, you cannot solve it with one element. It's like so many different elements. And then going to your first question about like how all the other modes are working all together. Buenos Aires has always installed, this is a little bit technical, but it has always installed their cycling paths on the left to avoid conflict with bus stops, which of course we all know that is a challenge that can be easily solved. But the way they instead of trying to address the problem, they just moved away from the problem. So all the infrastructure in Buenos Aires is set on the left hand, so that avoids conflict with buses and passengers going up and down from buses. That has been one of kind of the main things. And then putting a specific attention to the places where the cars they turn on the left, because it's the place where the car and the cyclist can have a collision. So there sometimes they have more signals, or they change we're trying to in these avenues to give priority to bikes, so that in the green lights they start before the rest, and this kind of small movements. When we can, we try to put parking in parallel to the cycle path to make this kind of cyclists, parked cars that work as a barrier, and then moving cars. But it depends a lot on the frequency and the load that we have on those corridors. So when we can, we do it. Otherwise, we don't.
We have a lot of questions now. Okay, so I'm
going to try to be synthetic then.
Okay, thanks, dear. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
So I'll come back to Vancouver. Tim Douglas, a planner from Vancouver, is asking about that. We don't put bike lanes on major streets in Vancouver, and what other economics data have you used to argue for cycling lanes on major streets, which can be related to another question that Samantha asked about the data collection process for different places that you did. So how did you get people to I agree to put it in major streets. We have this backlash in Montreal actually right now, going on major streets, and there's a big fight with the mayor on that. And what data collection you had to do to convince people about that?
So a little bit what I showed before in the presentation is that one of the key elements that was actually to show, and I'm going to go back 2 seconds, we showed actually the 6 out of 10 people were actually cycling out of the planned infrastructure. So basically 60% of our cyclists, they were in danger because they were cycling out. And I think that there's something that has to do with how cycling is perceived from a mobility point of view. And there's sometimes a little bit of a old school versus new school kind of dilemma or new paradigm, because when you talk with people that have been in transport for many, many years, they don't really consider cyclists as a valid or as a strong way of mobility. They consider it as an alternative, and it's a little bit hippie and yeah, whatever, but it's not really, they don't see cycling as a transport mode. So I think that that's one of the key elements to try to show over data, through data, that actually it is, and actually you already have 60% of the cyclists cycling outside of the structure in main avenues. And this is what this map is showing. And related to data collection, the team has been super, super good actually to, over this 10 years, do this data collection, which we do in a very primitive way. So every year, there's like a bunch of people that go out to the city and they stand in different points in the city and they take a counter and they start to count. Very easy. And that gives you a very simple, it's of course, it's a lot of manpower, but it's something we do once a year. And that gives you this kind of maps. And that's the data that allows you to say, do you want to ignore this? Because it's happening. It's your choice. Now it's your responsibility as a decision maker to realize that 60% of your citizens that are cyclists, they're not protected, and you know about it. So I think that, and maybe I'm sounding a little bit tough, but because that's a little bit the way you have to move in politics. Otherwise, it doesn't really happen.
What's the cost of this process? I know like manpower is not as like, how much do you budget for this event of sending people that much outside?
How much what, sorry?
Financially?
Because we do it with people that work within the
okay.
city. And we also have a contract with a university, the local university, the Buenos Aires University.
Students?
And they're with students, so it's very low. It's not very a big budget, actually. And it's also something that we do, like sometimes we have a lot of people, okay, today we all have to go and count. And there's a lot of people going there and counting. So it's not something that is necessarily very expensive. It's just going back to what Jan said, you measure what you care about.
So it means that you have to be taken to count for other groups as well at some times.
What do you mean?
City. Like other groups in the city will ask you for help. Like this is something inside the city, all of you are helping each other.
Yes, exactly. But the Secretary of Transport is big enough to actually being able to do this process. So yeah, we have a lot of people, so we can do that. And also the contracts that we have with universities makes it much easier because it goes back into part of a project that they do in university. So those collaborations are very, very good.
There's a lot of questions about equity aspects. And one of the questions that came from Sayana Sharif, she's asking, do you find it easier to implement bicycle lanes and plans and strategies between poor areas in the city and rich areas, how different it is or how hard it is to get a bike lane in both neighborhoods in terms of income groups. There are some areas that are poor, some areas that are rich. So there are some push sometimes from someone, or how do you see that in Buenos Aires?
So a bike is cheaper than a car, which is a very good news. We also have a bike structure that is free, where you can take a bike and then you put it in another station. But it has some challenges today. There's been a lot of robbery and stuff related to that. There was a lot of bikes that has been stolen. And actually, if you think about the income of someone that doesn't earn a lot of money, the cost of traveling in a bus, if you put it like over 6 months or something like that, 6 months of a bus is already a bike. So a bike is affordable. You can actually buy it, and there's we have been making alliances also with different like banks for them to give you like, okay, you can buy your bike over 6 months or over 1 year and stuff like that. So making this kind of plans really help. And actually it's one of the cheapest and more fair mobility ways. And you can of course have the hipster that drinks coffee in Palermo that has a beautiful bike, but you can also have someone that needs the bike to go to construction site and work there in that construction site, and that person can also arrive there by cycling. It's about giving the option to everyone to being able to arrive at their workplace or whatever they want to go in an affordable way. And cycling is actually one of the cheapest way of moving.
Earlier, like there's a lot of questions. I'm summarizing here. Jamie's helping me summarize some of the questions so we can have a precise one. So earlier you noted you had to shift the conversation around cycling for decision makers to saying, okay, you have this number, it's your sense of responsibility, and you have to give them a bicycle lane. How did you get the merchants and the people, the stakeholders to be engaged with you? In Montreal here, for example, the mayor and the planners want to put the bicycle lane, but the business district doesn't want it, or the merchants are saying, no, the shops, they don't want the bicycle lane. How did you get them engaged with you about that?
Yeah, so there's something about the new paradigms are always challenging to implement in a city. And sometimes we in conversations get super technical and this corner and this place, and it's very important in those conversations with neighbors and with offices and somehow to go a little bit back and talk about the macro, no? To think like, okay, the model of mobility that we have today in cities is not sustainable anymore. And this is not something Buenos Aires is saying, everyone in the planet is saying this. So we have to find alternatives, and we have to invite people for a diversity of mobility elements. We cannot still go and invest for this car-driven mobility way, because cities that have that model collapse. So those are one of kind of the big arguments. And then we have gathered also a lot of data that shows that it's not, because there is this fantasy somehow, or this fear that the shops, they will die if a cycleway appears. Actually, there's no data of any cycleway in the city that has created that at all. And if there was a change, it was a positive one. Because when you are in a car, it's quite hard to stop for a minute. And if there's another car coming, you cannot stop and go and buy something that you forgot before you're going home. If you're in a bike, to stop and to park it and to buy and go out is much easier. So actually, again, data. The data is the key. They go to this people that are worried about their shops and show, hey, this is not happening anywhere in the city. This is not happening anywhere in the world. Why don't we try it out and we see what happens? So there's also this argument of the pilot projects, like, let's try it out. Don't worry. If we see that in 2 years is a catastrophe, then we think about it, we talk about it. But let's try it out. We always have to give ourselves the benefit of the doubt. And actually, the shops don't die because there's a cycleway. That's a little bit of a fantasy that is, yeah, I think it's something that comes from the old transport way of thinking. And those are kind of the arguments that they try to use, but they're not very, when you look at data, is not like that.
It's a debate going on in Canada till today. This old way that you're talking about, it's happening in Canada, although they have been given the data in many cases, but they're still arguing, saying we're going to die.
I think, Ahmed, there's also something about having a strong vision as a mayor. And what is it that you want to leave in your city? And where do you want your city to go? And what kind of livability you want to create? The biking element has become, in this century, something that a lot of young people want to be part of, because it's also part of this hipster life. You know, you have your bike, you go and take some coffees in the city, and then you go to work. And that was one of the many buttons we were pushing. Oh no, we were pushing buttons all over. We're just trying to make it work. And this kind of voters element was very, very important. But at the end of the day, what you need is like people that are innovative enough and brave enough to make things different.
That's good. I'm going to end with the last question that came from Anastasia about the COVID and how did COVID impact your plans and impacted your idea? Like you have these ambitious plans. Did it help in accelerating some of them, or did it help in backing up on some?
Totally. So the building of the cycleways in Avenue Córdoba and Corrientes were actually a backlash or a consequence of the COVID-19, because we were already working on it and we were already pushing for it. And I was just like, with everyone that I could in the team, pushing for this project to happen. When COVID-19 appeared and we were in this pandemic situation, a lot of other challenges appeared. So public transport was in 30% of capacity. The subway is in 4% of capacity. So if we wanted for people, not everyone, to go back to the car, the ones that could go back to the car or starting to buy a car to be able to move, you needed to give a choice. So the COVID-19 has really accelerated a process that was already ongoing, but has really, really accelerated because there was a very strong demand of people wanting to use a bike as a mobility way. And if you looked at bike shops in the city, I think it was almost the only place, together with the pharmacies and like grocery stores, where there was like big queues of people like trying to fix their bike to be able to move. Because after 7 months of being inside your house, when the government tells you that you can bike in the city, as a recreational way or as a transport way, then people go crazy and start buying bikes. So it has really, really accelerated a process that was ongoing. And you can see it in the numbers, like it's 232% more cyclists in these avenues, which is insane in 1 month. I've never seen in my experience such a big jump in cyclists in so short time.
That's great. It's great to hear that. Thank you so much, Carlota. There's a lot of questions. I have to end now, unfortunately. And it was inspiring, and it's really great to learn about your efforts at Buenos Aires and what you have been working on and how you have been implementing things on the ground. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I hope it was helpful, and yeah, we will keep in touch.
We'll be in touch. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.